Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of History Quest. I'm your host, Brian Haynes. I am the director of the McLeod County Historical Society here in Hutchinson. We have a special episode for you this month, as this will be broadcast to the Hutchinson 4th grade class. They have been studying Native American history, specifically the Lewis and Clark journey across the continent, and I was asked to share my knowledge with them about Native Americans in McLeod County. And I said, absolutely. So I thought, for something different, for something fun, we would just make History Quest about this month so that they could watch it. So what we have here is a outline of McLeod County. McLeod County is right in the heart of Minnesota, and it has a very rich history, and that does include Native Americans in the area. We know that Native Americans have been here for centuries. We don't exactly know when. The classic theory is that they traveled here after the last ice age from Asia. There is some evidence that contradicts that, including their own oral histories, their own legends that say they've been here forever. We really, I guess, we'll never quite know. All we know is that they are the true Americans, those who lived here before any of the Europeans came over to this continent. In Minnesota, centuries ago, we're talking about 400 BC, there was a culture called the Hopewell, and they're known as the Mound Builders. They didn't actually live in Minnesota year-round. They lived in the central part of the United States, in Ohio, actually. In that area, there's a huge city that was built by the Native Americans sometime in about 200 BC, and it's the Mound City. It's called Cahokia. At any rate, from this culture that existed in the central portion of the United States, you had these mound builders, and they would follow the river north in the summertime, and they would come up into Minnesota, as this was a summering grounds for them, and they built mounds all over the state. A lot of the mounds they built were for rituals. They're like religious sites. They built effigies, which are mounds that are shaped like animals. And they also built altars. They had burial areas. Evidence of the mound builders in McLeod County is very scant. We're not even sure if they were in this area because they weren't widespread across the entire state or what would become the state. They were just in certain pockets of the state, especially along the Mississippi, parts of the Crow River, along the North Fork of the Crow River. Down here, there is some evidence that suggests that they may have camped or summered around the Hutchinson and Glencoe areas, but we can't be certain, as what people think may or may not have been mounds have been so deteriorated away from farming that we just can't discern whether or not they actually did live here. Although early records from settlers coming in, some of them do claim that these mounds did exist in the area, but again, we can't say for sure. So it's just a mystery. In more modern times, we have in Minnesota and North and South Dakota, parts of Iowa and Nebraska, and even a little bit farther west and east into Wisconsin, we have the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota lands. These are white settlers would refer to them as the Sioux. And they were split into three kind of, I shouldn't say nations, but kind of like three states, if you would, or three groups. You had the Lakota, who are out in the west in the Dakotas. You had the Nakota, which were kind of in the middle, and you had the Dakota, which were in the east. And so in Minnesota, you had primarily the Dakota people. If you go north a little bit of us, past the North Fork of the Crow River, you start coming into Ojibwa land. Now that was a different tribe, of course. And the Ojibwa and the Dakota were actually big rivals. In McLeod County here, we had mostly just Dakota people. It was Dakota land, so there was no Ojibwa camps in this area. However, they would come south to raid the Dakota camps, and vice versa. The Dakota would go north and raid their camps. So they had a Very, very long-standing rivalry between the two. In this picture, we kind of see the division of the Dakota, the Nakota, and the Lakota. It just kind of shows where they originally had their holdings, and as you can see, the Dakota were some of the most prominent, the biggest of the three. They had their ancestral homeland in all of Minnesota. Here on this picture right here, we're seeing this is the bluffs where the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River come together over by Minneapolis-St. Paul. This was the Kaposia, was the name of the city, if you will, that they had that was on this area, or that was on this land. When white settlers came in the early 1800s, they bought much of this land from the Dakota, and which the Dakota moved to the west a little bit. Contrary to popular belief, the Tipi that the Dakotas would have lived in were very much a temporary lodging, if you will. They actually, in their permanent villages, they lived in these, they weren't quite a longhouse, but they resembled kind of an A-frame sloped roof house that Europeans would later go on to build. And the reason they lived in these, especially in the summer, was that it was cooler, much cooler than the teepee could be. So most of your permanent villages that existed at the time, you would have seen something like this versus the teepee. The Dakota primarily existed on buffalo, just like many of the Native American tribes in the central and western part of the United States. They were also expert farmers. There's this, notion that when the white settlers came in and the natives were on the reservation, the white settlers had to teach the Dakota how to farm, and that's really, I've always thought was kind of funny, because the Dakota had been farming for years on a much smaller scale. When white settlers came into Minnesota at first, they explored the land. The first that were here were French fur trappers, and they traded with the Dakota quite extensively. When the Americans came in the early 1800s, we see American fur trappers come in, and one of which was Martin McLeod, of course, which this county is named after. On this picture right here, this was painted by Les Cuba, a Hutchinson native, and Martin McLeod is overlooking Buffalo Creek, and he sees a Dakota camp. This is actually a depiction of what it may have looked like at the time. Glencoe was originally a Native American camp. It was a summer camp by a man named John Otherday, and they would camp along Buffalo Creek on what would become Glencoe for years until white settlers came. And actually, when Martin McLeod led the first party of white settlers to Glencoe, he did so knowing that it was a good camping spot. In the 1850s, as more settlers were moving west and Minnesota was going to become a state, it was already a territory made in 1848, and they knew that settlers were going to want to come in and move onto the land. So the United States government came into a deal with the Dakota, which sold off a wide swath of their land. This was in 1851. It's a famous treaty called Traverse de Sioux, and the Dakota sold off nearly all of their land in Minnesota. In this picture, you see the red portion. That is the reservation that the Dakota moved onto. The orange area is what was their land, and that's what the United States bought from the Dakota. They bought it for pennies on the dollar, which means they bought it for nearly nothing, because the Dakota sold it for nearly nothing. And the Dakota moved onto this tiny little strip of reservation. Everything was fine at first, but eventually they felt like they were cheated out of their land and they weren't happy with the reservation. One of the main leaders of the Dakota at the time was named Little Crow. And Little Crow played a big part in this treaty negotiation. And one of the reasons why he signed the treaty was because the buffalo were disappearing, and the Dakota really had no money to spend, and they had no livelihood anymore. And so he felt he realized that the world was changing and that they were going to have to change and they were going to have to adapt to the world around them. So he played a part in the treaty and signed his name, effectively selling his portion of the land, and they moved on to the reservation. With that money, they would be able to buy food and clothing, guns, ammunition, anything that they needed to survive. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and the Dakota in Minnesota became very poor. And in 1862, in a way to try and get their land back, they went to war with the white settlers that were living on their land. It was a very horrible war. It didn't end well for the white settlers living there, and it didn't end well for the Dakota who were fighting against them. The U.S. Army eventually came in, and the Dakota warriors that were fighting fled the state. Some of them stayed and were captured. And the bulk of the Dakota people that were in Minnesota were rounded up and sent to a camp in Fort Snelling, which is close to Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the Twin Cities. And they lived in this camp for quite some time. It was both kind of could be seen as a punishment for starting the war, and also to keep them safe from settlers who would be looking to hurt them. So it kind of went both ways. But eventually, the government shipped the Dakota out of Minnesota and into reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. Since then, they have been allowed to return. They haven't gotten all of their treaty holdings or reservation holdings back, but they have gotten some. So Little Crow played a big part in this war. He was one of the main leaders of the warriors, and he actually brought his group of warriors into Hutchinson and attacked Hutchinson. The townspeople in Hutchinson had built a fort in Library Square. There is a little monument there today that says a fort once existed on this site. And in September of 1862, most of the residents in the Hutchinson area, a lot of them were living in the fort. Some of them stayed on their farms outside of town, but a lot of them were living inside the fort. And on a September morning, Little Crow and his warriors marched into town and started attacking Hutchinson. The people that lived on the outskirts of town and the farms, a lot of them rushed in to try to get to the fort before the Dakota warriors could reach them. Some of them died, some of them made it. Little Crow and his warriors, like I said, attacked the town. They burnt down every building except for the Harrington Merrill House and, of course, the stockade. They weren't able to get close enough to the stockade to burn it down. But at any rate, they did effectively destroy the town, and they only fled when they spotted soldiers coming from the Glencoe area. And they fled the town. So Little Crow and his warriors eventually would flee the state as the army was after them. Little Crow went into Canada to try to get support from the Canadian government to fight back against the United States, but he couldn't get any support. He eventually came back into Minnesota and came into Hutchinson, just north of Hutchinson, actually in Meeker County. And he and his son were picking berries, and there were two white settlers from Hutchinson who had been out checking on their herd of cattle that was in the area that was north of Hutchinson, and they saw Little Crow and his son picking berries. Now, at that time, Little Crow was a wanted man for what had happened during the war, being that he had led the war and a lot of settlers were killed. So Little Crow was a very wanted man, and there was a reward for his capture, whether he was dead or alive. The two people from Hutchinson, their names were Nathan and Chauncey Lamson. They were father and son, and like I said, they had seen Little Crow picking berries, and so they fired their guns at him, and a small fight came after that where Little Crow fired back. He was eventually shot and killed on the site. Nathan and Chauncey Lamson fled the site because they were afraid that there might be more Dakota warriors in the area. And so they ran back to Hutchinson and raised the alarm and said, there's warriors in the area, where, you know, we could be under attack. So of course people, I'm sure, I don't know if they panicked, but I'm sure they were worried at the time. Meanwhile, back at the site where Little Crow was killed, his son stayed with him until he died, and then his son fled the scene, or fled north towards Canada, and was later captured as well. The next morning, people from Hutchinson went out to where the fight happened, and they found Little Crow's body. They weren't sure if it was Little Crow yet at first, but at any rate, they drug the body back into town, where they mutilated it and put it on display. And again, you have to remember at this time, people were very afraid of the warriors because of what happened. So that's part of why they treated the body of Little Crow so badly. Eventually, they found out it was Little Crow, and the two Lamsons were given their reward, and the body was taken away and hidden. The bones would eventually go to the State Historical Society in Minnesota. Later, however, they were returned to the Little Crow family, and then they were buried on one of the reservations. But at any rate, the story of Little Crow with Hutchinson is part of the reason why we have the statue overlooking the river just off of Main Street. And that is to be able to remember that, not so much that Little Crow led a war against Hutchinson or anything like that, but a way to remember that Little Crow, the entire Dakota people, that this was also their home at one time too. And although bad things happened between the settlers and the Dakota, it's still important to remember who was here before we were, and just to be that, you know, this is part of all of our history, not just one group or another. I'd like to remind you also that if you come down to the Historical Society Museum, we have quite a few Native American artifacts. We even have some things that Little Crow had once owned and given away as gifts later. But we have those in our museum, and we have many, many stone arrowheads, axe heads, a lot of Native American artifacts at the museum. Not to mention we have a lot of artifacts of just old-time stuff that that people had collected over the years, tools, clothing, all kinds of stuff. So it's a really, really interesting place to visit, and I highly encourage you to come down and take a look at it. So in a nutshell, that is the history of the Native Americans in McLeod County. There's much, much more, but unfortunately, I just don't have the time to be able to tell the story in any kind of great detail or any length. So I would just kind of hit the high points and gave you the gist of the story. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it, and I hope you take that and decide to learn even more about it. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the show.